In this lecture, you're going to learn what is a route parameter, how to read them from your Express app, and how to respond to route parameters. So, what is a route parameter? Route parameters are the named URL segments that are used to capture the values specified at their position in the URL. For example, let's say we have this URL. Now, in this URL, this ID is the route parameter. When we make a request to this URL from the client, in that case, for this ID, we need to specify a value. So here you can see this ID is a named URL segment, and while requesting this URL, in place of ID, we specify a value. For example, we can type this URL something like this. Here if you see, the value of ID is 4. In the same way, in this example, the value of ID is 23. And in this example, the value of ID is 217. Okay, so a route parameter is basically a named URL segment that is used to capture the value specified at its position in the URL. Okay, so in place of this ID, we need to specify a value, and that value will be captured and used by the Express app. Now, let's understand how to read the value of a route parameter from the Express app. Currently, what's happening is when we are making a GET request to this URL, to this endpoint /API/v1/movies, we are getting all the movies in the response. So if I click on this send button, what will happen is a GET request will be sent to this endpoint, to this URL. And in the response, we are going to receive all the movies which we have inside the movies.json file. Okay, so here you can see we are receiving all the movies which we have inside the movies.json file. Now what we want is, we want to create an endpoint where when we send a GET request, we want to get only single movie. And we want to get that movie based on its ID. So for example, the endpoint will be something like this. So this part is going to remain same. After that, we want to have a route parameter. Okay, and for that route parameter, when we pass a value, let's say 2, in that case, we should receive that movie in the response whose ID is 2. If I pass 4, in that case, we should receive that movie in the response whose ID is 4. Okay, so we want to create an API, and when we send a GET request to that API, we want to receive a single movie in the response based on the ID of the movie. Let's go ahead and let's implement that API. So here we have this GET API, which is sending us all the movies in the response from this movies.json file. Now we want to create another API, and there also we want to handle a GET request, and the endpoint is going to be API/v1/movies/the ID. So this ID is going to be the ID of the movie, and this ID is going to be a route parameter. Basically, instead of ID, we need to specify a value for this ID in the URL. So let's go ahead and let's create this API. So on this app object, we are going to use this get method because here we want to send a GET request. And here, first we need to specify the endpoint. So the endpoint is going to be API/v1/movies/ID. Okay, now this ID is going to be a route parameter. And to specify that a particular segment in the URL is a route parameter, before that segment, we use a colon like this. So this colon specifies that this ID is a route parameter. So when the user will type this endpoint, this URL, instead of this ID, he need to specify a value for this ID. Alright, and the second parameter is going to be the route handler function. And this route handler function is going to receive a request and response object. Now the question here is how we will know what value the user has provided for this ID parameter. For that, on this request object, we have a property called params. And that params is an object, and in that object, all the route parameters are stored as a property of that object. Let's actually see that. So let me go ahead and let me log this params object. So for that, let's say console.log, and this request object has this params property, and this params is nothing but an object. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's log this params. And for now, let's simply send some response from this endpoint. So for that, let's use this send method. And here, let's send a text response, and let's say maybe test movie. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's stop the server here by pressing Ctrl C. And here, what I will do is I will go ahead and I will install nodemon so that we will not have to stop the server and save the file every time and then restart the server. So here, let's go ahead and let's install nodemon. So for that, we can use this command npm install and then the name of the package. So name of the package is nodemon. Let's press enter. So the nodemon has been installed. Let's go ahead and let's run this app.js using nodemon. For that, we need to type this command, nodemon space app.js. Let's press enter. So the nodemon has started. It has started the app.js file. And now what will happen is every time we make some changes to these files and when we save it, nodemon will recompile the files and then it will restart the server. We don't have to do it manually. All right, so here we have created our API. So this API, let's go ahead and let's test this API. So let's go to Postman. Let's open a new tab. And here I want to send a GET request. Let me copy this URL from here. Okay. And let's say in the response, we want to get a movie whose ID is 4. So for that, for the ID route parameter, we are specifying this value 4. If I go ahead and if I make a request here, a GET request, you will see in the response, we are receiving this message test movie because that's the response which we are sending from this API, right? And you will also see that for this request.param, when we are logging this request.params, an object has been logged here. So as I mentioned, this params property is nothing but an object. And in that object, we have an ID property whose value is set to 4. And keep in mind that this value is a string value. So this 4 is a string value here. It is saved as a string. So this params is going to store an object, and in that object we will have all the route parameters as its properties, and the value for those properties will be the value which we will pass in the URL. All right, so currently we are passing 4 here, so that is the value which is assigned to this ID route parameter. But if I go ahead and if I make another request and there if I set this value to maybe 100 and if I click on this send button, in that case now you will notice that the value of this ID is 100. So remember that all the route parameters are stored as a property of the params object, and this params object is a property of this request object. Okay, now here we are only specifying one route parameter, but we can also specify multiple route parameters. So for example, I can go ahead and I can specify another route parameter, let's say name, and then I can go ahead and I can specify another route parameter, let's say X. So now we are specifying 3 route parameters. Okay, so let's save the changes here. Let's go back to Postman and let's make a request. So for the ID, we are passing this value 100. For the name, let's pass John. And for the value X, let's pass 12. And let's click on this send button. Okay, so again in the response, we are receiving this text test movie because that's what we are sending from this API. All right, and if you notice here, an object has been logged, and in that object, all these 3 route parameters are its properties. Okay, and the value which we have specified for these route parameters while making the request, those are assigned to these properties. Okay, so 100 is assigned to ID, John is assigned to name property, this name route parameter, and 12 is assigned to this X. And if you notice, all these values are stored as string, even though we have specified number 100 and this number 12, but they are also stored as a string. And this is very important to remember because when you want to use these values, if you want to use them like a number, then first you will have to convert them to a number. Okay, so in this way, we can also specify multiple route parameters. And also remember that when we specify multiple route parameters, we need to pass values for all those parameters. Otherwise, we will run into an error. So for this API, we are expecting the value for 3 route parameters. Now, if I go ahead and if I make a request and if I specify values only for 2 route parameters, here I'm not specifying the value for the 3rd route parameter. I'm not specifying the value for X. If I go ahead and if I make a request, you will see that we have run into an error. That's because in our URL, the endpoint which we are specifying here we are expecting value for 3 route parameters. But from the client, we have only passed value for ID and name parameter. We have not passed value for this X parameter. So that's why we have an error. Now, what we can also do is we can make a route parameter optional. And to make a route parameter optional, all we have to do is after that route parameter, we need to use a question mark. So in this way, I am making this X parameter optional. So now what will happen is even if I don't provide a value for that X route parameter, we are not going to run into an error. If I click on this send button, you see, we are not getting any error. We are getting a response. And if I go to VS Code, you will notice that for the X, it is assigned with the value undefined. That's because for this X parameter, we have not passed any value. So by default, it is using this value undefined. And here we are not running into an error because we have made this X parameter optional. And to make a parameter optional, after that parameter, we can use this question mark. So if I use this question mark after this name parameter, in that case, this name parameter will also become optional. We can either provide a value for this, and if we want, we can also omit the value for that. In that case, these optional parameters will be assigned with the value undefined. All right, so let's get back to our implementation. Here we don't need this X parameter and this name parameter. We only need this ID. And just now we saw that this ID will be stored inside this params object as its property. Now what we want is whatever value we are receiving for this ID property, based on that ID, we want to get the movie object with that particular ID. So let's say for the ID, if we have passed 2, then from the movies.json file, we want to get that movie object whose ID is 2. So basically, we want to get this movie object. And we want to send this movie object into the response. Let's see how we can do that. So first of all, we know that inside this params object, we are going to have an ID property, and that ID property is going to store the ID value, but it is going to store that value as a string. As you can see here, the ID value is stored as a string. So first, we need to convert it to a number. For that, let me go ahead and let me create a variable. I will call it ID. And to convert a string value to a number, what we can do is we can use plus operator on that string value. So here, this id.params, it is an object. This object is going to have an ID property, and this ID property is going to store a string value. Now we want to convert that string value to a number type. For that, I can go ahead and I can use this plus operator on it. Okay, or what we can also do is we can multiply that string value with 1. So that will also convert that particular string value to its numeric type. Alright, so here we are converting the ID value to a numeric type. Let me comment this console.log statement here. Now what we want is, based on this ID from the movies array, so here inside this movies array, we are storing this array, the array which we have inside this movies.json file. Right, so inside this movies array, we have an array of movie objects. So from this array, we want to filter that movie object which has an ID which we are receiving for this ID parameter. So for that, what I'm going to do is, on this movies array, I'm going to use find method. Okay, using this find method. So basically this find is a JavaScript method which we can use on an array, and this method returns an element from an array based on a given condition. Now to this find method, we need to pass a callback function. So here I'm passing an arrow function, and this callback function is going to receive that element on which the find method is currently looping over. So what this find method is going to do is, it is going to loop over this movies array. And for each iteration, it is going to pass the current element on which it is currently looping over to this callback function. So let's call that EL. So here, for the first iteration, this find method will pass the first movie object and it will assign it to this EL parameter. For the second iteration, this find method will assign this EL parameter with the second movie object. For the third iteration, this find method will assign this EL parameter with the third movie object, and so on. So inside this EL, we are going to receive a movie object, and we know that that movie object is going to have an ID property. So if the ID of that movie object, if it is equal to the ID which we have received in the route parameter, so we are storing that inside this ID variable. So if it is equal to that, in that case, we want to return that movie object in the response. Let's also use this return keyword here. Or what we can also do is, we can remove these curly braces. Okay, so in that case, we will not have to use the return keyword. And here also, we can simply call it EL. We don't need to put it inside parenthesis. All right, so here, this find method is going to return that movie object where the ID of the movie matches the ID which we are receiving for the route parameter. Let's go ahead and let's store that movie object in a variable, and let's call it movie. And finally, let's send this movie in the response. So here we want to send a JSON response. So instead of send, I'm going to use JSON method. And before sending the response, let's also set the status code. For that, let's use this status method. And there, let's set the status code to 200. Now here to this JSON method, let's pass a JSON object. So for that, I'll use a set of curly braces. Inside that, here we are going to use the JSON format. So we have learned that in case of JSON format, in the JSON object, first we specify the status of the request. So here the status is success. Then we use the data property, and to that data property, we assign an object. Basically, here we are using the concept of enveloping. So here we are enveloping the object which we want to send in the response. All right, then here let's create a property called movie. And to this movie, let's assign this movie variable. Okay, so here we are converting the ID to a numeric value. Then here we are finding the movie based on the ID parameter. And then here we are sending a response. So basically here we are sending that movie whose ID matches the value of this ID parameter, and we are sending it in the response. All right, with this, let's save the changes. Let's go to Postman. And here, let's say we want to get that movie in the response whose ID is 4. Okay, so for the ID parameter, here I'm passing this value 4. If I click on this send button, we should receive that movie object whose ID is 4. Okay, so name of the movie is test, release year 2018, and duration is 90 minutes. So if I go to VS Code and if we go to this movies.json file, here we have that movie object. So here the ID is 4, name is test, release year is 2018, and duration is 90 minutes. So based on the ID of this movie, we are finding that movie, okay, and we are sending it in the response. If I go back to Postman and here if I pass, let's say 3, then we should receive that movie object in the response whose ID is 3, as you can see. Okay, let's also save this request. So here let's call this request as get movie by ID. Okay, let's save this request and we want to save it inside this my collection. All right, so everything is working as expected. But here also we have a bug. Now the bug is if I go ahead and if I pass an ID, let's say 12, with this ID, we don't have any movie inside the movies.json file. If I go to this movies.json file, here the last movie has this ID 5. Okay, so total we have 5 movies inside this movies.json file, and the last movie has this ID 5. So if I pass 12 here for the ID of the movie, we don't have any movie with this ID 12. In that case, if I click on this send button, you see in the data we are not receiving anything, so the data is empty, but the status code is 200. Okay, now here since we are not able to find a resource, the status code should be 404, and the status here should fail because with that ID we are not able to find any resource, so the status should be fail. Status code should be 404, and we can also show a message in the response saying that movie with this ID is not found. So let's go ahead and let's implement that. Let's go to VS Code. Let's go to app.js. And before we are sending the response, let's first also check if there is any movie with that particular ID. So here I'm going to use an if statement. Now, what should we put inside the condition? Well, this find method is going to return a movie object if the ID of any movie matches the ID value which we are receiving in the route parameter. But if no movie matches the ID value which we are receiving in the route parameter, this find method is going to return undefined. So for example, for this ID, if we receive 4, in that case, we have a movie object with the ID 4 inside this movies.json file. So the movie object with ID 4 will satisfy this condition. In that case, this find method will return that movie object and that will be assigned to this movie variable. But for this ID value, if we receive 12, then none of the movie object will satisfy this condition because none of the movie object's ID will have the value 12, right? So none of the movie will satisfy this condition, and in that case, this find method will return undefined. So this movies variable will be assigned with the value undefined. So we can use this movie variable here inside this if condition. Okay, now keep in mind that undefined is a falsy value. So when we use it inside the if statement, the undefined will be type coerced to false. On that, let's use this not operator to convert it to true. So If there is no movie object found, in that case, we want to return a response. So on this response object, let's first set the status code and let's set the status code to 404, not found. And then let's send a response. And to send a response, let's use this JSON method. Okay, inside this JSON method, let's specify an object and there let's set the status to fail. All right, and let's also specify a message property. And let's set this message property with a string value, let's say movie with ID, and then let's use this ID variable is not found. Okay, and once this response is sent, we want to exit this callback function, this route handler function, because if we don't exit that, in that case, after this if statement, we are again trying to send a response. So in that case, we will get an error. So from here, once this response is sent, we want to exit this function. For that, let's use this return keyword here. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to Postman. And now if I make a request to this URL, we know that we don't have any movie with this ID 12. So if I make a request here, in the response, we should receive this message. So here the status is fail and the message is movie with ID 12 is not found. But here if I specify 3, then with this ID, we do have a movie inside the movies.json file. So in that case, we should receive that movie object in the response. Okay. So this is all from this lecture. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.